And welcome to this SMMR Net webinar. This is the second one in our 2022 series, and I'm really excited for us to have two talks today. One from Dr. Abigail McQuatters-Gollop, who is an associate professor in marine conservation from the University of Plymouth. And we'll also be hearing from Dr. Chris Leakey, who will be talking about from his role in People, Ocean, Planet as part of MASTS, the Marine Alliance of Science and Technology for Scotland. We're going to have both presentations will be about 20 minutes long, which will leave us with 20 minutes for questions at the end for us to end the webinar promptly at 2 o'clock. If you have any questions, can you please put them in the Q&A, and I'll be looking out for them and we'll be asking them at the end. And if you have any comments or that, pop them in the chat and I'll see them as well. But without further ado, let's hand over to Abigail to begin her talk.
Hiya, thank you so much for the introduction and thank you very much for having me. So I'm Abigail McQuatters-Gollop from University of Plymouth, and I'm going to try to share my screen. I practiced, so it should work. So hold on. Okay. Hopefully you see my presentation and not my notes. Okay, so it's nice to meet you guys. I'm going to talk today a bit about my experience in science and policy and how I've worked to connect research and data done in science to decision making. So as we're probably all aware, marine biodiversity is not in a good state right now. And in 2019, IPBES declared a biodiversity emergency. And we see headlines with things like ecological meltdown and urgent threat to loss of Earth's natural life. And these are really scary and distressing headlines. And if we look further at like the IPBES report, it shows that 1 in 4 species are at risk of extinction. And that extends to the marine environments where we've got reef corals, sharks and rays, and mammals, and of course, birds and crustaceans. So marine biodiversity reflects that of the rest of the Earth, and it's not really in a good way right now. But there is some good news. So international agreements are increasingly recognizing the importance of marine biodiversity. So we can see that at the international level with the Sustainable Development Goals, and we have our very own goal, SDG 14, Life Below Water. We can see that with the CBD, which parts of the CBD mention marine directly, but we might expect to see that more explicit in the upcoming post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And then here in Europe and the UK, we have the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and in the UK, it's called the UK Marine Strategy. Pretty much the same thing, just post-Brexit, that's what we call it. And it's all about holistic management and applying an ecosystem approach to our marine environment to achieve good environmental status. And the great thing about the UKMS or the MSFD is that it explicitly mentions biological diversity or biodiversity as one of the 11 descriptors of good environmental status. And not only is there a descriptor called biodiversity, but there are also descriptors for food webs and seafloor integrity, which are integral aspects of healthy biodiversity. And it's quite innovative to have a piece of legislation that actually says, look, our marine biodiversity and our marine food webs have to be in good status to have a healthy marine environment. So we have more good news. The other good news is there's lots and lots of great science going on out there in the UK, in Europe, and globally using robust data, good models, to give us excellent information about the marine environment. But where we do need to get a bit better at this is taking that information and turning that into evidence that can be used to underpin or support policy. So we want to make sure that the science that's being done is actually used to inform policy and management decisions about how we look after our marine environment. So there's lots of different things I could talk about here, but I'm a plankton ecologist, so we're going to talk about plankton. So in the EU and in the UK, we've had this policy challenge where we needed plankton indicators to support our UK marine strategy and our EU MSFD. So not only did we need plankton indicators, but when we look across the UK and we look across Europe, we have all these plankton data sets that are collected in different ways, using different methods of collection or analyzing the plankton to different taxonomic resolutions or counting them differently. So what we really need in the UK and Europe to underpin our decision-making about biodiversity are plankton indicators that can use all of these time series with all of these different methods to provide evidence for underpinning decision-making. So I'm not going to go into any technical detail here. If you want it, there's loads of papers I can send you. But the solution that we ended up with was a suite of flexible plankton indicators that we can use with lots of different plankton data types, lots of different time series, lots of different methods of collection. So we have these indicators, but I want to talk about how we've been able to take this science and this data and successfully use that to underpin decision-making. So I thought I would go with some lessons that we learned during this whole process in the UK and Europe. So what is this process? So the MSFD, the UK Marine Strategy, both strive to achieve good environmental status of our marine waters. And we do this by looking at biodiversity indicators and monitoring those towards targets that represent good environmental status. So we've been reporting on these indicators for since 2017 at OSPAR, the EU level, and 2018 in the UK. And we're doing our next set of assessments for 2023 and 2024 right now. And this has been an amazing process to be part of because I think it's quite unique globally. And I feel like it's been really successful and I've been really proud to be part of it. So just in brief, what we've ended up with are biodiversity indicators and targets that have been co-developed between policymakers and scientists. So this is the case with plankton, but it's also the case with marine mammals, marine birds, non-commercial fish, food webs, benthic habitats as well. So this has allowed us to use lots of data sets in innovative ways because data are collected in lots of different ways. And the result has been the science has informed policy. So here's an example of the reporting or the output from our 2017 assessment of good environmental status for plankton or pelagic habitats in OSPAR. Okay, so what have we learned about why were we successful and what have we learned? So I think a key thing that we've learned here is to always start with the basics. So if you work in something like mammals or birds or commercial fish, you know, it's easy to get policymakers to care about what you're working in. With plankton, it can be a little bit harder. So I think always starting with the basics is quite a clear message. And whenever I talk to policymakers, I'm ready. I say why they should care about plankton. And I've got facts like they produce half of the world's oxygen, they're key to carbon cycling, they're high in diversity. This means they're crucial to ecosystem functioning. They have clear links to humans, they're sensitive to climate change, base of the food web, all of this. But it's not only the message that we're giving, but also what's important is how we present that message. So we could do that through a slide like this with a bunch of words, but you know, that is a bit boring, okay? And we look at slides with words all the time. So I think it's really important to think about other ways that are fun or engaging to communicate our message into policy. So just because we're working with policymakers, it doesn't mean we have to communicate in a really boring or dry way. So it might be hard to see on your screen. It is hard on my laptop right here. But the same messages that were on the last slide, I've had made into infographics. So there's two infographics here. One is why are plankton important for policy? And the other is plankton provide critical ecosystem services. And they take facts that were kind of on the last slide, similar facts about the role of plankton in food webs, the role of plankton in carbon cycling, nutrient cycling, mitigating global warming, you know, supporting our fisheries, giving us fish as a food source, giving us oxygen to breathe. And they put it into a more fun and engaging format that can be used in lots of different ways. So I might show a section of this when I give a talk to policy communities, or I might bring some handouts, or I might put them on my social media as infographics. So that's just, you know, thinking about how we communicate the basics. But of course, there's a lot more to that, to getting science used in policy. So another key reason, and I probably should have led with this, actually, I was working on my talk until literally 1 minute before you all joined me, as usual. Another key part of our success is that we've co-developed our indicators with policymakers. So often, there's in the scientific literature, we've got scientists, they're like, oh, there's a problem. What should we do about it? Okay, we solved this problem. We put it in a scientific publication and we publish that in the literature. Well, policymakers often usually, I would say, don't have time to read the literature. First of all, a lot of it's not open access. How often are you on your phone and you click on something and it's behind a paywall because you're not at your university desk or you haven't looked on Sci-Hub to get that article? So often they're behind a paywall. Policymakers move around a lot through the civil service, or MPs don't have expertise in everything. And a lot of policymakers or civil servants don't access the literature. And if they did, they don't have time to read it, and their level of expertise may not be the right level of expertise for reading a scientific article on my niche subject of plankton indicators. So for our work here, instead of just coming up with indicators that we publish in the literature, we have worked really closely with policymakers to co-develop these indicators. So how does this work? So with the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, now the UK Marine Strategy in the UK, this is a piece of European policy. It was handed to the Regional Seas Commissions to implement. So for the Northeast Atlantic, that's OSPAR, right in the middle there. And then OSPAR is made up of all these little groups called ICGs, intersessional correspondence groups. And I'm part of one called COBAM, which is about biodiversity and monitoring. And each of these groups is made up of scientific expert groups. So in my OSPAR group, I lead the expert group for plankton pelagic habitats, but there's one for benthic, one for mammals, one for birds, one for fish, one for food webs, like that. And these scientific expert groups are made up of representatives from each national science network. So I also lead the UK Pelagic Habitats Network, which is made up of all the plankton experts with time series in the UK, like Plymouth Marine Lab, the Marine Biological Association, Continuous Plankton Recorder, CFAS, Environment Agency, SAMS, Marine Scotland, all of these people. So from this diagram here, you can see that we start with a piece of policy, and then at the ICG level of OSPAR, the policy and the science come together, where the scientific expert leads, like myself, work with policymakers. And this means we have a continual dialogue with policymakers, not just from our own country, not just from the UK, but with all of the OSPAR countries. And we can have easy, casual conversations about indicators. We have formal conversations about indicators. Do my indicators work for your policy needs? And then they say, but are these scientifically robust? Yes, we have this consensus that we've developed through our national science networks, and then through our OSPAR science network as well. So here is where we end up making sure that our indicators, our science, is appropriate for policymakers, and also where we develop scientific consensus that supports these indicators. So, this works because right from the outset of the project, so I won't go into detail, but we funded this work with lots of different projects. When we develop these projects to fund this policy work, we work with policymakers to make sure that what we're proposing to deliver is useful for them, and that what the science that we want to do will meet policy needs. And this means we do a lot of framing science in policy terms. So, when scientists are together, we say stuff like, oh, this could be interesting. We do not talk like that in front of policymakers. Instead, we say, this bit of science is useful for Marine Strategy Framework Directive Descriptor 1, Criteria 6, or whatever. We link it really closely, our science really closely to policy needs. And this also means that we have to use our policymakers or advisors and listen to them. So sometimes they might say, you're not communicating that, it makes no sense, it's not working for me, which is criticism that can be a little bit hard to hear. But they're basically our customers here. So we have to make sure that what we're proposing and what we're delivering does work for policymakers. And that means we need to put a lot of effort into engaging with policymakers and not just give presentations. So I'll give you some examples of ways that we've engaged well with policymakers. So I showed the infographic already, but there's other ways as well. So basically, when we started this process of indicator development, everybody was bored because all it was people talking in front of a PowerPoint, kind of like I'm doing now. The irony is not lost on me. But we got a lot better as time went on. So we have these meetings where scientists and policymakers are together. And we had this meeting in Marseille where some scientists, so that's me holding a cat that I met at the lab, and Ian next to me, who's also a scientist, and on the end are policymakers. We were all paired together, and like basically it was matchmaking. So we spent the whole meeting together, sat by each other, had coffee breaks together. And this was great because it allowed us to better understand each other's needs and also to develop, trust and like a relationship with people that we might not normally talk to. So the projects that I've worked on often have these science policy advisory boards made up of our stakeholders or policymakers. And we quickly realized if we just invite them to watch talks, they kind of zone out, right? So instead, we asked them to come prepared and give a talk about their understanding of our work and how we could steer it in a direction that is helpful for them. And that's a lot different than just showing up and listening, right? Because you have to be prepared, you have to be ready to engage, and it gives you a different level of understanding as an advisory board member than just showing up as just an audience member. We also got them to pour our drinks at one of our drinks receptions. We've done a lot of working in breakout groups. So instead of just having the scientists go into a room and work together, which is how we started, we've realized that we need to mix these breakout groups with scientists and policymakers and have clear goals and objectives that we need to accomplish that can only be done by all of us together as a group. And you should see like the atmosphere in the room when we do this. People are super engaged. Everybody's talking. No one's checking their emails. You can see that their computers are open to the spreadsheets that we're working on. And it's a lot more interactive, and we get a lot more out of the experience by working rather than just talking at people. A change of venue also works. So we go to these OSPAR meetings, and because people come from all over Europe, they're very intense, and we cannot leave until the work is done. But by like 5:30, 6 o'clock, you're really burned out. So what we've realized is if we have a 20-minute break, we go somewhere else, a different venue, preferably outdoors, we can get another couple of hours of work out of people if they have a beer or a glass of wine next to them, and they're just in a different location. So here we're actually working, and we wrote a proposal that started at that picnic table in Hamburg that was funded for €1 million. So changing the venue does re-engage everybody. One of the best things we did was science policy speed dating. We had policymakers on one side, scientists on the other. We had 2 minutes to communicate our indicator and to work out if it would work for that policymaker. Somebody had a bell, and every 2 minutes the bell rang and you moved to the next person. It was brilliant. Everybody was like shouting because we needed to get our points across. We learned how to do it better the further it went on. It really helped us as scientists learn how to communicate better. And the policymakers got a lot out of it, and they figured out the right questions to ask of us to get the best out of us, kind of like role playing. Building personal relationships has also been key to our success. And part of this is socializing. So talking to other scientists and policymakers when you're not just working. And this has really worked for us at OSPAR. Now we get to meetings the night before and we all have dinner together or drinks together. We're genuinely, closer. And this means it's a lot easier to make a quick phone call or send an email and be like, hey, Andrew, can I just ask you this really quick question? Without having to go into the hi, we haven't met, but I work on this, without going into the backstory. And so this kind of socializing, creates trust and bonds, and you figure out what you have in common as individuals. So it's really, really important that when you're communicating, you always communicate your science in the right format. So if you're doing something for a minister or an elected official, you might use traffic light format. If you're communicating to a civil servant, maybe it's a report card that has more information. If you're communicating to an environmental manager, maybe you have a book or a protocol document. But it's really important to think about the needs of the audience that you're communicating to and tailor your communication to that audience. So even if you have one subject or one indicator, I always think, who am I communicating this to? Is it to a minister? Is it to a civil servant? Is it to a scientist? Then I might use the literature. And that brings me to my next slide, which is about modernizing communication. So there are ways that we communicate our science and our work outside of just these formal channels. So social media is one of those. So this is just an example of my Twitter front page, but I've got several thousand followers on Twitter. I communicate my science all the time to them, and I listen when they communicate to me. And part of the great, the great social media experience is that we are more than just our jobs, and we can show our personalities. So I also have a blog that helps me do this as well, Plankton and Policy, and it's followed by DEFRA and the European Union and the European Environment Agency. So, there are ways that we can promote our work and our science to people that care about policy and stakeholders outside of social media, or outside of formal channels. So here's a couple infographics that I made, and we made a tweet storm. So I wrote tweets for my whole UK expert group team to use, and we had JPEGs that went with each tweet, and we had a hashtag that we piggybacked onto a conference hashtag. And I wrote a strategy of when we would tweet what things from what institutes, and it went to all the PR departments, and we had a tweet storm, and it got a lot of people exposed to our work that otherwise wouldn't have been. And it was cheap to do, not loads of effort, and it raised the profile of our work. So this informal communication is really, really valuable. Again, more infographic examples. So I only have one more slide, don't worry. A couple of examples where we have been really successful. So the report cards for the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and for the UK Marine Strategy. So right here, you can see two different examples of policy communication. So on the right, this was one page about all these bits of the ecosystem for the UK Marine Strategy that went to the ministers. You can see the traffic lights. And then on the left, it's a 2-page A4, much more detailed than the product on the right, and the 2-page A4 went to the civil service. So 10 years of my career was summarized with a little orange dot and one sentence about pelagic habitats and plankton, which it's quite shocking to see, but this is how you communicate to different audiences. So basically, in summary, connecting with policy is really important to getting science used in policy. And this can happen in lots of different ways, through formal channels, through informal channels, but communication and engagement take work. It doesn't just happen on its own. I'm always talking about the work that I'm doing. Admittedly, plankton can be a harder sell than dolphins, but I think it's really important to keep people engaged, to keep repeating the same message in lots of different formats. And I try to create my own engagement opportunities through social media or through networking. And I also kind of want to remind everybody, when I'm in these meetings, we talk about policymakers like they're these aliens, but they're not. They're just regular people, the civil service, regular people. There are lots of different ways to relate to them on a level besides just work. And I think creating this trust and building these bonds are really important. So I have to show a picture of the most famous plankton of them all, from SpongeBob, who has been brilliant for helping communicate who plankton is, because if anybody has kids, they know who plankton is from SpongeBob. So thank you so much for having me. Here are my contact details, and I'm sure they'll be circulated if they weren't already. I wish we were in person, but thank you so much. So I'll stop sharing my screen now and hand it back over.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Abigail. That was fantastic. I love any talk that ends in plankton. Fantastic. If anyone has any questions, just a reminder that you can pop that in the Q&A, and we'll be asking them after Chris's talk. And I'll hand over to Chris now.
Hi, everybody. Just get my screen share going. So yeah, thank you, Abigail. That was a fantastic talk, lots of great stuff in there, and I think there was a few of us who enjoyed our first bit of socialising between science and policy colleagues in Bristol at the SMMR conference last week. So I'm going to be speaking to you about something a bit different. It's about a project that is a small part of work I've been doing while on secondment to MASTS. So for those of you who know me from marine policy work at NitroScot, you're forgiven for thinking this is a bit outside of my usual remit. The project was called Dive In, and it was an interdisciplinary museum exhibition for public engagement in marine science and climate action. And through the POP initiative from MASTS, we were just one of a diverse set of partners. it was about more than just an exercise in public engagement in science, but also an exploration of different techniques and ideas for engaging and influencing a museum audience. The POP initiative, if you're not familiar with it, is all about bringing insights from the social sciences together with the marine sciences for some applied research, but also for impactful outreach. We therefore, in this project, helped frame this exhibition's purpose and its approach in the concepts and the theories of behavioural change and ocean literacy, while through our role in MASTS also being able to tap into our network of marine scientists and help interpret some of the more technical content for a public audience. Next slide, there it is. And as you can see, it was open for about 4 months from last October, overlapping with the COP26 event in Glasgow. That was deliberate, being seen as a local contribution to the national conversation around climate, albeit with our bent towards the ocean. The primary funders were the Cooliste-Gulbenkian Foundation and Museums Galleries Scotland. The work was led by the University Museums team in collaboration with the Scottish Oceans Institute, which is where MASTS and the POP teams within it also happen to be hosted. The basic idea was simple enough in that we were recognising and responding to two things. First, that shifting public knowledge, attitudes and behaviours is fundamental to tackling climate and ecosystem challenges, having a synergy with democratic and socially just approaches to marine management. And the second is that museums and other cultural venues have a role with the freedom and the expertise for creative approaches that can influence people. But we wanted to explore some ways to do this. And that started with getting people with different skills involved. That initial partnership covered some of the bases, but there was also a need to commission the services of other specialists, including design consultants, an environmental psychologist called Adam Corner, and a museums interpretation and evaluation consultant called Steve Slack. This mess is my own fairly muddled impression of the complexity of the process, and it's what I'm going to talk you through today. There was lots going on in parallel, connections and arrows all over the place, and lots of moving pieces. And of course, it all happened during lockdown. So most of the people involved, I have still never met in person. So we wanted a call to action, but a solutions focused one. And this is where the communication psychology started, by wanting to avoid a doom and gloom message that leaves people fatalistic. So it partially became an experiment to play with how we reflect lessons from psychology in a museum exhibition that seeks to trigger behavioural changes in the audience. It also became important to try and make the exhibition and its development as low impact as possible, so to practice what we preach. I wouldn't say much more about this, but it gave some focus on the materials used in the displays and their fate when the exhibition was over. Of course, COVID meant that the collaborating team couldn't travel anyway, so we made do with the online situation. Within this call for action, we wanted to help people make the connection between their daily lives in the choices they make with the consequences for ocean and climate. And so while an ideal outcome would be to influence people so deeply that they make new and lasting behavior changes, we recognize the importance of the building blocks of behavior change, that not everyone will or can make that leap immediately, but that positive shifts in knowledge, attitudes, and good intentions also have merit as outcomes from public engagement. And then behind the scenes, we have this process of learning as we try out interpretation and presentational techniques. Concept development for the exhibition was not a distinct task. We kept coming back to it and refining it, but there were some key aspects on which we landed. First, we made it a persona-led experience in which people were invited to self-identify and follow a narrative. And there were symbols for each of these identities that was based on their existing level of engagement. This was us recognizing that we can't just throw everyone into the deep end, but that we need to meet people where they are, so to speak. This also helped us organize some of the different types of behavioral asks that we were making of visitors, with some simple actions accessible to everyone or most people, as well as presenting more challenging actions for people ready to push their personal boundaries. And we included some that are more about normalizing conversations about sustainable lifestyles and daily choices rather than, truly tangible actions. And we included behaviors that were more about democratic action, participating in campaigns and making informed representations to constituency politicians. This pick and mix of behavioral asks came from being mindful of people's agency or ability to take particular actions. So students renting accommodation have limited powers over the quality of their home insulation and are unlikely to be buying electric cars yet. But for other museum visitors, that's an entirely appropriate and realistic option. We generally erred on the side of actions accessible to most, but did include some of those bigger asks for people that were ready and able. The final key part of the concept related to the flow through the exhibition's narrative, starting people in the deep sea and gradually moving them up through the water column and closer to shore, all the while connecting the science and the condition of these marine environments to our own everyday actions. I'm going to come back to this in a moment, but first of all, just to say that one of our key tasks within the partnership was to gather ideas for content and case studies from marine science. This bit was led by my colleague Hannah, who had a string of sessions with researchers, getting them talking about their work, identifying key messages and how it may be conceptually linked to the behavioural change messages of the exhibition. So we gathered all this in a massive virtual whiteboard, which is all that tiny writing you can see, and handed it over to the museum and its interpretation, curation, and design leads. In here, we also identified objects and visual aids that the researchers would be able to offer up. We structured these conversations roughly around those three ovals, the themes there that are shown. At the time, we wondered if these would become the core messages of the exhibition, and they didn't become explicitly so, but were inferred in the content and served the purpose of organizing our minds at the time. So back in the core team, this was all helping develop the concepts and identify the emerging themes and narratives. Now this screen here, this is not an exhaustive list, but you can see some examples here of how the journey through the depths from the deep sea up maps to some of the marine science themes and how this linked conceptually to some of the behavioral asks being made. These conceptual links were in some cases very direct, such as making the link between deep sea minerals and the overconsumption and waste of those same minerals in electronic products. While in other cases, the connection was much more tangential, such as in the mid-ocean, we talked about the science of underwater noise and linked that to the importance of normalizing conversations and being heard on the subject of sustainable living. Fisheries and seafood was, of course, an easy one for making direct links, and then again, slightly more tangential as we connect various aspects of marine climate science to energy choices and energy efficiency. As people left the exhibition, they were then back on terra firma, presenting us with an opportunity to re-articulate and drive home that our choices on land, in our homes, shops, fields, vehicles, and offices are still connected to consequences at sea, whether through climate change or as an additional stressor on the marine environment. I'm not going to linger long on this page, but suffice to say there was a huge amount of work done on cataloging potential objects and images, video and audio for use in the exhibition design. These, alongside our long list of science case studies, were whittled down to a much smaller number of chosen items and the content that was used in the end. This process also involved some prototyping from the museum staff, whereby interpretation concepts and mock-ups were tested on groups to help refine the general approach and the presentation of visual material and the articulation of text. Eventually, this all took shape as really exciting three-dimensional digital fly-throughs, plan elevations, and preprint mock-ups of display panels. On the left, sorry, it might be a bit small, but there's a couple of examples in yellow of the panels that included the behavioural asks that were connected to those personas that people were meant to be choosing. These all included a selection of QR codes that guided people to further resources and guidance on that topic. As we edged closer to the opening day, the museum hosted and supported events not immediately connected to the exhibition, but on themes that supported and built up towards the exhibition opening. These included several podcasts, marine-themed musical events, and art workshops. So these were all in themselves mini collaborations between the museum, marine scientists, and others. Finally, October came, and although COVID was still on the loose, so a grand opening was not on the cards, but the rules had at least relaxed enough that we didn't have to make the exhibition a by appointment only experience. So that was a great relief at that time. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the evaluation work, which helped reflect on what worked well and what didn't work so well. Although a key message really is that formal evaluation of public engagement efforts is not easy. It's not an exact science. And frankly, it's not helped by the fact that people really don't like filling in surveys. So there does come a point where you need to rely a bit more on your instincts and more informal reflections, maybe with visitors, but also within the collaborating team. So we were looking for changes to behaviors, but also those underpinning shifts in knowledge, attitudes, confidence, and so on. And we wanted to gauge the effectiveness of interpretive tools. There were three main elements to the evaluation. There was a visitor survey, a couple of focus groups, one with students and one with general visitors, and some structured observations in the museum where visitors were observed on how they interacted with the overall space and specific exhibits. Regarding the visitor survey, this was available online, but actually most responses were achieved by intercepting people in person upon exiting the exhibition. With nearly 5,300 visitors, a return rate of 3.3% doesn't sound great, but neither is it awful as these things go. The overall number of visitors was not as much as would be expected outside COVID times, so that's predictable enough. So just some highlights then, and there is a report available if anyone would like to delve deeper. First, some feedback in relation to exhibition design and the visitor experience included that simple and interactive, playful displays are most effective. Well, that's fairly intuitive. And we would have done more, but were somewhat curtailed by the risk of touch points in the pandemic. Next, some visitors said they wanted the content to be more provocative. Again, perhaps not surprising, as we likely attracted some people already with strong feelings on the issues. However, we were mindful of two things. One was that we wanted to try and inform and empower people rather than antagonize and agitate. And also working with scientists, we wanted to find the right balance with sort of level-headed, evidence-based advocacy and avoid this being perceived as too campaigny. Next, for some, the breadth of subject matter was overwhelming. This I can sympathize with, and indeed we did have to make some tough choices on what to include and what to exclude. But I can see there would be merit in exhibitions that give deeper attention to a narrower subject area. The audio and the video content through the exhibition was for some visitors a distraction from the other content, and museum staff often turned it down when they started getting that feedback. And finally, the persona-led approach was not 100% successful in that some visitors ignored them on the assumption that they were for children because of the logos used. Nevertheless, they still served a purpose in allowing us to group and tailor behavioural asks appropriate to different types of visitor. Moving on, one of the opportunities in working with cultural partners and behavioural change outcomes is finding emotional levers that are not necessarily open to traditional science communication. And we've had this with some of our other projects, sort of more arts-based engagement projects as well. Visitors expressed a broad spectrum of emotions, from people feeling angry or challenged to feeling curious, inspired or motivated. About a quarter left feeling generally positive. Now that's not as high as we wanted because we aim to provide people with solutions that would leave them more optimistic. About a third left with heightened curiosity, wanting to learn more. Well, a third, again, it's not much, but we'll take it. When we look at knowledge, or at least perceived knowledge as a building block of behavior change, not surprisingly, based on global and national media coverage, concern was already high around issues of plastics and fisheries. But we can take some credit for introducing most visitors to the issue of deep sea mining and the growing demands for minerals used in technology. And while we provided lots of links to further online resources and practical guides, lots of visitors are hungry for more of this, and also for suggestions on volunteer groups and events where they can take part in activities that are more practical or social. Overall, most visitors said that the exhibition positively reinforced existing knowledge. So it's then really interesting that most also said that the exhibition triggered new intentions on their own consumption and waste behaviours. So this supports my personal view that so-called preaching to the converted is not wasted effort, because there are lots of people, including many of us, I'm sure, who are well versed in sustainability issues, but without translating that into personal actions. Of those good behavioural intentions, this included what we termed intellectual and social behaviours. So that's the sharing, the learning and the talking about the issues and solutions with friends, family and colleagues. The power of normalizing these conversations is not to be underestimated. So we welcome this as a contribution to accelerating shifts in social and cultural norms. Finally, I just note that collaborations that reach beyond our comfort zones to unfamiliar sectors and disciplines are not necessarily easy and need good project management, but they can be hugely rewarding from a professional and a personal perspective. The cultural sector in particular has a huge appetite for helping marine scientists reach public audiences. And I'm a firm believer that we need to embrace the insights from psychology and sociology to have better outcomes in stimulating those shifts that we need, which in turn can catalyze, the enabling actions from governments and corporations when we see it scaled up. And now, just for a very brief plug, please watch this space for a new tool we're working on, which is to be prototyped soon, called the Ocean Partnerships tool, which will essentially be a matchmaking and networking tool using algorithms, a bit like a dating app, to match people to others with skills and interests that can then spawn fruitful partnerships. It will be as inclusive of as many sectors and disciplines as we can think of. It will be somewhat experimental, but we hope can elevate ambitions and opportunities for lots of us, with marine science and scientists at its heart. If you're interested with being involved in the soft launch and trialing of this tool, please email Liz at MASTS, who will hopefully maybe put her email address in the chat should you be interested in helping out there. I think that's me, and we'll move on to questions.
Fantastic. Thank you both for that talk. They were both really, really interesting. If anyone's got any questions, could you please put them in the Q&A section? We've got one already for Abigail, who says, how do you build relationships in the age of online meetings? Sorry, you're muted.
See, this is the problem with online meetings. How can you build a relationship when, yeah, it's so awkward. That's an excellent question. And I don't have a good answer for it. I find it really hard. I found it really hard during lockdown, even to relate, to talk to my students, because what you find is that you have, part of building relationships are casual conversation where you're standing next to somebody at coffee and they're like, oh my God, you have cat hair on you. Do you have a cat? Oh yeah. Oh, I've got cats. And then it goes to talk about whatever, wildlife and travel. And you can't do that online with people that you don't already know. If you've been in one of those online quizzes we did on Zoom during the first lockdown, I was in one with several people that I didn't know and I still don't really know them, because you can't have those casual conversations. So that's a really good question. And I do not have the answer. I've been at events where they try to put you in breakout rooms, but it's just so like, oh, it's so awkward. Well, I find it really awkward. I'm pretty sure everybody else did because I'm quite an outgoing person. So I don't have a good answer for you at all with that. I'm really sorry and I wish I did. But if anybody else that's watching this right now has an answer, please put it in the chat because I would love to hear it.
Great, yeah, it's the age, well, not the age-old question because it's not that old, but we're still asking it. Yeah, if anyone has any more questions, I'll ask a couple. It was interesting listening to both your talks that that both of you, there's a theme in that you're communicating and having to shift and re-look at how you share the classic, paper literature science with public. Is there any point at which are most memorable for either of you that just kind of sparked your motivation to continue down that kind of path? Any way we can convince more people that the personal benefits of getting involved in work like this?
Should I mean, I've had a couple like really really positive experiences. So I'm really lucky because I'm a lecturer, so I get to communicate science to students all the time. So I'm constantly surrounded by, enthusiasm and students are so great for reminding you why you do this work because they take it all up and they're like, this sounds great, this sounds great. But I try to, communicate enthusiastically all the time. And for me personally, it's gotten me into great opportunities. So for example, I was invited by the Emperor of Japan to go to Tokyo, meet the Emperor and the Empress, and give a talk with like translation and everything. And the reason that they invited me was because, I do really love communicating to people. So I like doing that anyway. I find that I like to communicate, and then that has resulted in opportunities. Like I was asked to go to be a witness to provide evidence in Parliament one time, which was the scariest experience of my life. Very, very scary. And I asked later why they asked me. And they said, oh, it's because we heard you could talk to people that aren't scientists, and a lot of scientists can't. I'm like, oh, well, fair enough. So yeah, it's definitely given me opportunities. And then I try to communicate those opportunities to other people to encourage them to, communicate to non-scientists. I mean, not every scientist wants to, and not every scientist needs to, but a lot of people, when they talk about something they're passionate about, they become excitable and enthusiastic, and that's really contagious to other people. So I try to kind of bring all those things into it.
Great.
I'll try and answer that as well. I'm afraid I don't have any anecdotes about emperors, so I can't quite live up to that. But I mean, I suppose I've had this experience of most of my career has been spent in the public sector in sort of the policy world with Nitroscott, and I've taken this sort of temporary sideways step into sort of back into the university system. And that's just been a bit of revelation in so much as, not just meeting loads of really interesting marine science academics, but also people from like work in psychology or School of International Relations, School of Management, arts and humanities, and kind of seeing the sort of climate and environmental issues through the lens of those subjects is a very different conversation, and it's an entirely new spin on it. So that's been really, and I've really enjoyed speaking to those sorts of people, and it makes you think about it all very differently.
Great, thanks both for your answers. We've had a few more questions drop in as well. Someone has said, relationship building can be challenging when you are actually challenging policy and decision makers. What happens when science is suggesting policy action that is unwelcome among policymakers?
Oh, that's a good question, because it is controversial and I've been in this situation. So I distinctly remember we were having a science policy meeting at Kew Gardens about 10 years ago. And we were talking about setting good environmental status and what does good environmental status look like. And we said, okay, so the scientists said, okay, this is kind of what we see. And policymakers wanted us to have low ambition, medium ambition, and high ambition targets for good environmental status. So that is challenging really what the scientists believed. And we said, no, it's either good or it's not good. You can't have low ambition good, because then it's all going to become low ambition good. So that was quite, none of it got personal or anything like that. And I think remaining good natured is like really key to success with this. And also providing evidence to back up your views is critical for getting policymakers to get on board with your side of things. So you have to walk that line between being an advocate and then also speaking objectively and backing up everything by evidence. And I think, being able to communicate in a way that links your work to something they need. So how do you frame what you're communicating? And also making sure that everything that you communicate is backed up by evidence is what I've found to be the most successful ways to get policymakers, when I say policymakers, MPs, civil servants, whoever, to kind of see my side of things. But I think the other critical thing is to be willing to listen to why not, like what the opposition is, and why that's their point of view. And that is something I've really had to learn, because it is like, when it comes to really hard, like working on post-Brexit stuff has been deeply painful for me because I'm just so pro-European. So I've really had to learn kind of to ask, okay, that's your view, which is different than mine, but why? And try to like figure out why that is. So then I can say, but did you know this? Supported by evidence and that kind of thing. I don't know what you would say, Chris, because you've come from like the other side of it. You're probably somebody that I've tried to convince to do something.
Everything you said, Abigail, is spot on. I guess the only other thing I would just, keep in mind is that actually, like, being a policy official or like a minister is really hard. You got it coming at you from all angles. Everyone's got there's lots of different opinions and views being thrown at you, and you got to try and weigh it up. And they're not only held accountable to from the point of view of evidence, but from their point of view, public opinion matters, stakeholder opinion matters. They often are working within the confines of the priorities of a political term, and so it is tricky, juggling, balancing all of those things as a policy person, and I think a little sympathy for that can go a long way.
I think you said something really key that as soon as I stopped talking, I wish I'd said. A couple years ago, I was seconded into DEFRA from university, and it was really eye-opening because it really helped me understand what Chris just said, where it's like decisions aren't made just based on science. Like there's a whole bunch of other things that decision makers have to consider when making decisions. And I wish I'd appreciated that a lot earlier in my career, because it definitely would have helped me with these difficult conversations for sure.
Great. I'm going to ask another question, but there's also a question that potentially Chris can answer by text in the Q&A section, if possible. Thanks. The other question is, do you think there is a role for specific policy scientist communicators, or do you think it's something everyone should try and do more of?
Do you want to go first this time, Chris?
I would say yes and yes. Basically, I think it's something that all or most scientists could get better at, but I would also appreciate it's not for everybody. There are plenty of scientists who don't want to, or might just not have the attributes that gets them there. And I think it's kind of recognizing the kind of limits of your own interests and skills, but that doesn't mean you can't work with people who do have those skills and interests. So I think it's there's a place for both, I think, basically.
I agree with everything Chris said. And I would say the great thing about science policy, like, well, science communicators in general. So I'm friends with people that run a really, really successful science podcast, is that they're really good at like figuring out the relevant bits of your work, because it's when it's your work, you're so immersed in all the detail that it can be challenging to communicate it to different audiences and figure out the stories that are important and leaving out the details you can leave out. And having worked with science communicators, they're really good at saying, what's the story, what's the key message, and helping you package something that is communicable and is interesting to like whatever audience you're trying to communicate to. So I agree. I think both things are important, but if you're not interested in it, consider working with somebody that is really passionate about and skilled in communication.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, if anyone else has any questions, then I'm sure either of the speakers wouldn't mind if you drop them an email. But I think we'll wrap up for today, as it is hitting 2 o'clock. Thank you everyone for attending. I really hope you have enjoyed it. Thank you to our two speakers. It's been fantastic to hear such great talks. And if everyone could keep an eye out on newsletters and SMMR social media, we'll be having another webinar popping up in another couple of weeks' time, hopefully. So keep an eye out for that. But thank you again very much, and I hope everyone has a fantastic day.